Hi, hi everyone. Um, Welcome back to my channel. And let me try to see if I can get to this as quick as possible. Not going to be as quick. I guess you guys know that my videos can be rather lengthy, and I know people's attention span nowadays is not all that great, even mine. So I'm going to try to make this as interesting as possible. Now, I had it all planned and prepared to go ahead and create a nice white background with all my lighting, making everything look all professional and everything. But one of the reasons I haven't really been doing many videos of late is because I have a 2-year-old. I have a toddler. He's not awake right now. I'm still up pretty early here in the morning trying to get the sleep out of my eyes. But he's all up in my Kool-Aid nowadays, you know? He If he's awake, he'll be out here banging on the door, following me around, wanting to grab my phone and do everything and be very distracting. So to avoid that, I said, let me get up real early in the morning and try to find a little quiet space in the house to try to see if I can get this video done. Hopefully you're not distracted by all that you see here. It may not be the most professional looking videos and so forth. And I haven't tend to have done videos like that because I just try to just keep it real, as they say. But anyway, I decided I'm going to get up and do my DNA results. Um, so I did mine through Ancestry.com. Now I know people have all sorts of reservations about their DNA, and I don't want to give it out there. And some things are probably true in what they're saying. Some things are wild conspiracy theories, but I've always been the type of person, I really don't have anything to hide. I really don't care. I'm only going around the sun once. They can do whatever they want to do with it, or whatever the case they may want to do. I'm not exactly worried about that. Never done anything to anybody, so I'm not trying to hide anything. Anyway, but I'm going to go ahead and reveal my DNA results, and I'm not doing the standard, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what I am. I'm not going to do all of that. Let's just get straight to the point and just get, I've seen the results already. I'm not going to pretend like I'm opening them for the first time or anything along that line. I'm not trying to give anybody any shock value or anything, because I think what I'm going to say is actually interesting regardless. I think that the most interesting DNA results reveals are those where a person gives a story before, the information about what they know, and then after getting their DNA results, stating what they found out. So here goes my story. I grew up, well, here I am wearing my hat of the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is our flag up here, and this is where I'm from. I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands, specifically St. Thomas, because we have 4 inhabited islands that make up the U.S. Virgin Islands. I am from St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, born in the city of Charlotte, Amalie. And for those of you who are looking at this video in some other country somewhere and have no idea where the U.S. Virgin Islands are, they are 40 miles east of Puerto Rico. So if you can find Puerto Rico on a map, just look a little to the right of that, and that's where we're located. We are a U.S. territory, so we are born U.S. citizens. Okay? So now that I've gotten that out of the way, even though I was born here in the U.S. Virgin Islands, I was actually raised on an island about 150 miles to the southeast of St. Thomas, and that island is known as St. Kitts. I've mentioned it a few times in some of my other videos. That is where my father was born, on the island of St. Kitts. Right next door, at its closest point 2 miles away, is the island of Nevis, where my mother was born. Okay? So again, I was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Thomas. My father was born on the island of St. Kitts, where I was raised, and my mother was born on the island of Nevis next door. Now, the island of Nevis is claimed to fame. For those of you who don't know, it's the island where Alexander Hamilton was born. Of course, you know, from the play Hamilton, from the hit play Hamilton, and he's also the guy that's on the U.S. $10 bill note. Alexander Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis, where my mother is also from. Okay? Now that we've gotten that out of the way. So, I was sent to St. Kitts as a little boy to grow up with my grandmother. That's my father's mother. Now, I grew up with her, and it wasn't until later on in my life. I was with her until I was 8 years old, until I pretty much left her to move to New York City to live with my father. You know, that's his mother I was with. It wasn't until I was gone that it occurred to me that she was a white lady. My grandmother, if you had to see her walking down the street, was an actual white lady. You know, of course, growing up in St. Kitts, she was socialized in a way that you would think she was a black person by all of her actions, the way she talked, and everything like that, because she was born there. But she was a white lady. But it never occurred to me when I was growing up with her, just to show you how kids don't really pay attention to color and so forth, you know? And of course, growing up in St. Kitts, it wasn't that big of a deal. So I just knew that when people used to talk to me and they knew who I was, they would say, oh, the white lady down the street. That didn't really mean anything to me. I just knew I had a grandmother. So anyway, it wasn't until I got older, one of my uncles, one of my father's brothers, said something to me in passing. He said, you know, Mama, that's what we called her, is of Portuguese descent. I was probably a teen at the time. I had no idea what he was talking about. I was like, okay, you know, ain't no big deal about it. You know, when you're young, you're not even paying attention to things like that. At least back in my day. So, paid little attention to that. Made no sense to me. Um, it's when I got older and Ancestry.com came on the scene, when I got on the internet. So we're talking about years ago when Ancestry.com first came up. I don't know. I started to develop an interest in trying to find out who I am, where I come from, what I'm really all about. And so what I decided to do, I decided to go ahead and do a little bit of research. So I went out there and I put my information out there on Ancestry.com. There was an older cousin of mine, my father's first cousin. I don't know the man at all. I've never met him. And he apparently wrote back to me based on the information I provided on the Ancestry.com website. But I never went back to Ancestry.com, so I had no idea that this man wrote me and was trying to share information with me. I don't recall where it was, but somewhere down the road, probably 10 years later, somewhere down the road, I think I eventually stumbled into the information and I was blown away by what I found out. Turns out that he is my father's first cousin. In other words, his mother and my father's mother, or my grandmother, were sisters. This man, his mother, was the firstborn of my great great grandfather and my great great grandmother. So he, being older than I, had some insight into the patriarch and the matriarch of our family. Turns out that on my father's side, through his mother, that my great great grandfather was a Frenchman. Now, I don't know if he was born in France and moved to the island of St. Kitts, or he was just born to French parents, or that was basically his heritage. His wife, who I know far less about, turns out to be that she was Portuguese. And her name was Mary de Jesus, and she was Portuguese. I know very little about her. He did not relay much information to me about her, because again, you know, it's a man's world, so a lot of time women just got lost in the shuffle. But she was of Portuguese descent. So that's on my father's side. On my mother's side, information came to me within the past 5, 6, 7 years more about my mother's side. Now, what I knew about my mother is the fact that, again, she was born on the island of Nevis, and I knew more about her mother because her mother and her father were not married. So naturally, when you have those type of things, you tend to grow up more, like my mother, you tend to grow up more with your mother than your father if they were never married. So I didn't know much about her father's side of the family until one day I decided to ask her, and she pointed me to someone else in the family. Once I went ahead and picked the brain of that person from the other side of the family, a whole wealth of information came to me. And what information came to me? Turns out that my great great grandfather on my mother's side, through my mother's father, turns out that he was also Portuguese. And he came from the island of Madeira, which is an island in the northwest of Africa, southwest of Portugal, which is owned by Portugal. Now you may wonder, Portuguese, what's going on with the Portuguese? Quickly, when slavery came to an end in the British colonies in 1834, a lot of the former planters or slave masters lost their African workforce. In doing so, a lot of these Africans who were enslaved for all these years were like, we're not going back to work for you guys. We're free, but we're not coming back to work for you guys. They walked off the plantations. These planters needed workers. So what they did, they brought in a lot of people from India, which had come under British control. Brought them over, brought them to the Caribbean to work in places like Guyana, where my wife is from, Trinidad, and a few other places. The French brought them into Martinique and other places up there. But another group of people that also were brought into the Caribbean to fill this labor shortage were Portuguese. Most of them came from Madeira. It was during this time that on my father's side, through his mother, that my ancestors came from Portugal. And it's also during this time on my mother's side, through her father, the patriarch of our family came from Madeira, Portugal. And I'm saying all of that because it's going to be something I'm going to mention here in my ancestry. So I just put that in. That's pretty much what I know about my family. Now, I need to point out one other thing. Now, my father's father, don't know much about him. I really don't know much about him because he died when my father was only 2 years old. So my father didn't really know him to really pass much information down on to me. My grandmother, who would have known him a little bit better, my father's mother, who would have known him because she was married to him, I was too young to ask the questions. And again, he died such a long time ago when my father was only 2 that I didn't know what questions to ask. I never saw the man to even ask questions about him. But as far as I know, he was the son of or the grandson of some man that came from England or Scotland or wherever, which explains my surname. So I just want you to throw that in. So just keep in mind Portugal and keep in mind the United Kingdom, Scotland, England, Ireland, wherever it is up there. Okay? Anyway, that now brings me to my results. 43% of my ancestry comes from the African nation of Nigeria. Now, before Ancestry updated my information, it was the other way around. I was actually 43% from Benin, Togo, and I guess the 13% after that was with Nigeria. That has been now flipped around to where I'm 43% of Nigerian stock, 13% Benin, Togo, 10% Cameroon, Congo, and Southern Bantu peoples. I am 7% Mali. I am 6% Ghana. And to round out the African side, I am 1% from Senegal. So 80% of my heritage, 80% total of my heritage comes from West Central Africa. So that's Nigeria, 43%, Benin, Togo, 13%, 10% from Cameroon, Congo, and Southern Bantu peoples, 7% from Mali, 6% from Ghana, 1% from Senegal. So it goes to show you, based on this information and based on how the percentages are out there, that my ancestry comes from West Central Africa, and you could tell that there was some migration along that coast over there. Okay, so my family seems to be scattered, or my ancestry seems to be scattered in that area of West Central Africa on the coastline. Okay, now when it comes over to the European side, I am 6% Portuguese. So no surprise there based on everything that I mentioned. I am 6% Ireland and Scotland. Again, not surprising based on the information that I just shared. I am 5% England, Wales, and Northwestern Europe. Again, no surprise there, based on the information I just shared with you. And I have 1% Spain, 1% Sweden, 1% Germanic Europe. The Spain, Sweden, Germanic Europe also should not be surprising, because if you're talking about that, you have to understand there was also a lot of migration in Western Europe. Vikings coming down from Iceland and further north, and they're coming down and conquering places that we call England today, France today, and so forth. So in their conquering, I'm sure seeds were spread, and I'm sure a part of my ancestry came through all of that mixing up and migration and conquering and so forth. And the same thing in West Central Africa. I'm sure the same thing happened there. In another DNA result that I also did, it sort of showed me a migration of my family, which is not surprising. My ancestry migrating from Eastern Africa, where it is believed that human civilization basically began. I shouldn't say civilization, but our species basically began and then spread out into the rest of the world. So what it shows me in the eastern part of Africa and going across like a line all the way across the midsection of the continent of Africa and getting over to the western side of Africa, which is where the bulk of my ancestry comes from the country of Nigeria. Now I want to end this video. I know it's pretty lengthy and I didn't really want to get this long. I just had to give some information because I also want to teach, not just revealing my DNA results. I also wanted to teach. And I had to mention one other thing. Keep in mind that whenever you see black folks generally doing these reveals, you're going to most likely see Benin, Togo, or Nigeria to the very top of the list. And you may wonder why. Well, one of the reasons is because the areas that we call Benin, Togo today, Nigeria, Ghana, all those places, were basically back in those days to the Europeans known as the slave coast. And the reason why they named it that was because this is where they got their bulk of enslaved Africans to cart off into chattel slavery onto this side of the world. So don't be surprised when you see black people revealing and they're going to look around and it's like, oh, Benin, Togo, and Nigeria, Ghana. Okay? Those areas were the core of where the majority of enslaved Africans came from, along with Angola a little further to the south. Okay? So keep that in mind when you see it. Now, another thing I do need to mention, keep in mind that back when chattel slavery was going on, when these Europeans, these Americans, the Brazilians, and whoever were dragging us, our ancestors, off into in chains, off into slavery, keep one thing in mind. Back then, there was no country known as Nigeria. There was no country known as Benin, Togo. There was no country known as Cameroon and so forth. They weren't countries. They weren't borders that we have today. These borders were later artificially created by Europeans in the early 1900s, the middle 1900s, and so forth. Back then, these people lived in tribes, and they didn't really have borders per se. So you had tribes overlapping. They had their territories, mind you, and so forth. So what happened when the Europeans came and created nations? A lot of these tribes, so you could have been a tribe that was over here in what is modern day Nigeria, and you could have been another tribe over here, which is modern day Benin, which was called Dahomey in the past. And when the Europeans came in and created borders, which is of course what causes so much tensions in the world today, all of a sudden now you had a tribe over here that did not like a tribe over here before the Europeans came, that the Europeans now all of a sudden put together and circled and put borders around them and said, you guys now have to live together. So again, keep in mind, these countries that I'm mentioning right now, well, other than the European ones, they were not existing back then. The lands were there, but they were different tribes living in these different areas. There wasn't any such thing as Nigeria and any such thing as Benin, Togo, and so forth. You had kingdoms like the kingdoms of Dahomey and so forth. So when you hear this, you could understand why you might have ancestry coming from different countries that we know of today. But back in the day, that was not the way that it was. Okay? So keep that in mind. Anyway, this video is close to 20 minutes. So let me just get off here and go ahead and upload it. And hopefully you guys enjoy what I shared. And that is my DNA ancestry. And I really, really hope that I educated some people on certain things. And I hope you will understand this whole DNA thing a little bit better and hopefully I educated you in some of the countries that are there and how they are, what they are today. Anyway, let me end this video. I may have bored you long enough, but thank you for tuning in. Subscribe, like, and share. Okay? You guys take care.